Greetings and welcome everybody. My name is Tom Banchoff. I serve as director of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs and as vice president for global engagement here at Georgetown. And in both those roles, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's, I was going to say tonight's, it does feel like the evening, doesn't it? Yeah. Today's presentation and conversation with Imran Hoque on the topic, Writing Saved Me, a journalist's experience as a stateless refugee. We're really so delighted you can be with us this afternoon to share your experience as a Rohingya refugee and your perspective as a prize-winning journalist covering the diaspora in the United States and many related topics as well. And in a moment, I'll introduce my colleague, Sudipta Roy, who will introduce our topic, introduce Imran, and Professor Dina Siddiqui, who's also joining us for the conversation. But first, just a word about the context for our gathering. This event, as many of you know, is part of a multi-year collaboration with the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, a nonprofit organization that supports independent international journalism of the highest quality. Our collaboration includes the Pulitzer Center International Reporting Fellowship, which each year supports a Georgetown student working on a journalism project at the intersection of religion and world affairs. And each semester we also bring a prominent international journalist to campus, as we're doing this afternoon. I want to thank our Pulitzer partners, especially Ann Peters and Kem Sawyer, who are with us this afternoon, as well as Dr. Ryan Craig, who anchors our team here at the Berkeley Center. Now, I think you'll all agree that the plight of refugees in today's world is a critical issue of far-reaching importance. Most clearly, from my point of view anyway, from the perspective of human dignity and human rights and all their complexity. But also, we know it's a matter of deep political concern, nationally and internationally, and unfortunately a topic that's often approached at a very high level of abstraction. Numbers get thrown around. We see arresting images, but we don't get a sufficient opportunity to really hear from refugees themselves, to understand their reality, the challenges they face, and all its complexity. Personal testimony and superb reporting are foundational, I think, if we're going to make any progress on this issue in the United States and around the world, and that's why it's so exciting to be with you here today. So with that, let me turn things over to my colleague, Sudipta Roy, a senior researcher with the World Phase Development Dialogue, which is an NGO housed here at the Berkeley Center at Georgetown. And Sudipta also serves as a research fellow at the Berkeley Center. So please join me in welcoming him and our panel.
Thank you, Professor Banchoff, esteemed guests, and distinguished colleagues. Education for forcibly displaced populations is a crucial complex issue, as it involves providing educational opportunities to those uprooted by conflicts, persecution, disasters, or crisis. Ensuring refugees access to education, a fundamental human right, is vital for their well-being and future. Religious organizations are key players in humanitarian responses, offering refuge, material and spiritual assistance, and advocating for addressing the root causes of crisis. They often serve as the primary education providers in such situations. Let me set the stage for our discussion today with some numbers, statistics. Although keep in mind, these are mostly estimates due to data challenges in difficult situations. According to the 2023 UNHCR Refugee Education Report, around 65% of refugee children attend primary school, but as they move up the education ladder, the numbers drop. Only 65% in primary, 41% in secondary, and a mere 6% may reach tertiary education globally. This is much lower than the non-refugee children in the host communities and in other wealthier countries. Around 20% of the world's refugees are in the 46 least developed countries. As a result, nearly half of the 15 million school-aged children miss out on their right to education. In many settings, including, as we will see, in Rohingya in Bangladesh, are a large challenge of humanitarian assistance of today. The Rohingya crisis in the Asia Pacific is one of the most prominent examples of displacement, driven by Myanmar's military atrocities. And since gaining independence, these refugees have been deprived of fundamental rights and their identity. While Bangladesh, now home to one of the largest number of Rohingya refugees, hosts 1 million of displaced individuals, with over half being children in need of urgent assistance encompassing education, health, food, and security. It's crucial to note that several 100,000 Rohingya refugees are residing in Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, India, and elsewhere. Of the 5 countries in the world that prohibit refugees from accessing public schooling, Bangladesh, Burundi, China, Malaysia, and Nepal, Bangladesh and Malaysia host the largest number of Rohingya refugees. Amid the chaos and adversity, however, stories of determination, hope, and opportunity emerge. We are fortunate today to have one of the remarkable individuals among us whose story underscores the power of education in building equality and human rights for one of the world's most marginalized ethnic groups. Please allow me to introduce Imran Muhammad Fazal Haq. Imran is a stateless Rohingya refugee from Myanmar who is currently in his 3rd year at Buffalo State University of New York, majoring in social work and journalism. Imran's story is one of unwavering resilience. He undertook numerous perilous boat journeys in pursuit of safety and endured detention in various centers over 7 years. During his exile in Australia's offshore detention center on Manus Island, Papua New Guinea, he taught himself English, both spoken and written. Imran is not just a student, but also a dedicated writer, human rights activist, and an advocate for refugees worldwide. He has shared his experiences and those of other asylum seekers in his writings. He has actively represented students from 7 city colleges of Chicago as a student trustee and led the Nu Lambda chapter of Phi Theta Kappa Honor Society at Truman College. Imran is deeply committed to empowering the younger generation through the Rohingya Youth Club in Chicago and is a board member of the Rohingya American Council from New York State. Even while pursuing his college education, Imran continues to raise awareness about the lives of refugees, asylum seekers, and immigrants in the US and beyond. His journey and his work are an inspiration to us all. I would also like to introduce Professor Dina Siddiqui, who I know dearly, as the discussant for today's event. Professor Dina Siddiqui is a cultural anthropologist by training. Her research, grounded in the study of Bangladesh, joins critical development studies, transnational feminist theory, and the anthropology of labor and Islam. She has published extensively on the global garment industry and supply chains, non-state gender justice systems, and the cultural politics of Islam, feminism, and nationalism. She is currently engaged in a project of discourses of national development and the travels of civilizational feminism. Professor Siddiqui sits on the editorial board of numerous journals, including Contemporary South Asia, Dialectical Anthropology, and the Journal of Bangladesh Studies. Professor Dina Siddiqui just traveled from New York today, so a warm welcome to Professor Siddiqui and Imran. And I would like to request Imran to give his brief remark right now.
Thank you, Sudipta Roy, for your kind introduction. First of all, just a few years ago, I never thought I would be able to talk about my experience and work in a country like the United States, because wherever I went, I was stuck in detention center. So it's a great honor to be here with you all and to share my work and also my experience as a stateless Rohingya refugee. My name is Imran, and I am a Rohingya American writer. And the first question that always I have in my head, so I always ask myself, why do I write? What's the purpose of writing? Um, and I write because writing allowed me to let the world know that Rohingya people exist. So in our country, we were not allowed to get an education. And that's one of the tools that Myanmar government used to persecute Rohingya people. Because if you are not allowed to have an education, you don't have a voice, you don't speak the language of your country. You cannot be involved politically. You cannot serve your country. And that's exactly what they did. And they didn't allow us to get an education. They made our people illiterate. So when they made our people illiterate, and now, because of the persecution, we are leaving our country and we are in different parts of the world, and we are still affected by the persecution because we are in other countries, but we don't have the knowledge to share our stories because the Myanmar government didn't want us to share our stories. They didn't want us to have a voice. We didn't have a voice in our country. We don't have a voice in other countries too, because when you leave our country, we are still stuck, like in Bangladesh. Let's say there are nearly 500,000 Rohingya children. They are growing up in Bangladesh and they are not allowed to get a formal education. We are talking about a lot of issues, like I'm just focusing on the education. Like, okay, our people want to get an education. So, they are trying to focus on Myanmar curriculum. Some people are saying, yes, we want to have Myanmar's curriculum because we want to go back. Are you realistic? Has it happened? It has never happened. So, we are stuck between conversations. Some people want to have the formal education, but they want to follow Bangladesh curriculum. But there is another problem. Bangladesh government is not allowing our children to go to school because they think that if we get that education, then we will live in Bangladesh. We won't go back to Myanmar. So why should you go? But we have to find a way. We have to provide education to the Rohingya children. If we don't help these children to get an education, so we'll have a lost generation. We can see what's happening because we also have a lot of Rohingyans who are coming to the United States, and I don't see many Rohingya students in colleges and universities. And why? Because when we bring refugees to the United States, when I came to the United States, I thought, like, okay, everything will go smooth, nice and clear. Everything is beautiful here. I was so happy to be here. I didn't know anything about the policies. And then, I struggled, but I had hope. And I saw that things can be done. Things are difficult, but things can be done. So I continued my journey with my education, and then now I am here. Now I'm just a bit like I'm trying to help the community, and I'm also trying to be part of this country. That's why I'm writing, because in our country we couldn't write. We didn't have the language. We were not able to part of the country. But I am here, I am writing because I want Americans to know that we live here, we exist. But refugees are not, Rohingya children are not in schools, not in college, not in universities. And why? Because the policies that are in place are very they are not effective. Like when refugees come to the United States, they are supposed to become self-sufficient within 3 months. And when you are bringing a community like Rohingya, they didn't have the opportunity to have an education. They never worked. And you bring them here, they don't have the language, and you want them to become self-sufficient in a country like the United States in 3 months. And if you come here with a family, then their parents are struggling. Their parents never went to school. They have no idea about the education system, and they are just struggling on a daily basis because of the policy. They are stuck in that poverty cycle. They will always be poor. They will not have the opportunity to send their kids to school and college and get an education. Why I'm talking about the Rohingya diaspora? Because the Rohingya crisis is enormous. It's like beyond our control. Like when I'm trying to focus on Bangladesh, Myanmar, and the refugees who are stuck in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and also in Thailand, in other places. From here, I can't solve anything. That's why I started working on the Rohingya diaspora, and I had the opportunity to write multiple stories for the Police Center. And when I work on my project, I focus on many different angles. So if you read my stories, you will see there are a lot of angles. I talked about isolation. I talked about refugees. I talked about statelessness. And then I also talked about generational trauma. So one generation is passing trauma to the next generation. And also, I was talking about the U.S. policies that need to be changed because, when the U.S. government bought Vietnamese refugees, the U.S. government held Vietnamese refugees, I believe, more than 3 years. And now what happened, Vietnamese refugees are well educated, they're well established. But now they changed the policy. Now they are only supporting asylum seekers and refugees only for 3 months. Only for 3 months. And it's not just enough. It doesn't make any sense. So when you read my stories, you will see all these angles. And my hope is that, with these stories, would be able to make a difference, and the policies need to be changed because if we don't provide, forget about Bangladesh, you have Rohingyas in the United States, and if they can't get an education in a country like this, it's a shame for all of us. And I will just have a few words about Jen and Jahan. It's a story that I worked on, and they are in their 70s. When I was working on the project, I wrote their stories, and I just have a quote from them. I just want to share, like, when you suffer persecution, but we still continue our life. There is a lot of resilience, and also they continued their journey through their faith. They lost everything, but they had their faith, and they don't know how long they are going to live. But they just wanted me to share their last words. Their last words were, "We don't know how long we will live, and our last wish is that we die in our home so that we can continue to practice our beliefs and tradition that define our existence." They lost everything, but through faith, they are surviving, and they will survive. Thank you all. I will finish there. Thank you.
Professor Dina Siddiqui, if you would like to respond to his remarks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really, thank you everybody for organizing this and inviting me. But it's really a privilege and an honor to hear you and to learn about, I did not know your story until last week. It's very sobering, but it's also a story of hope. I was thinking as you were speaking of education and why education is denied, first of all. Why there is so much fear around education, and there are different reasons in different times and spaces, but it's there, and the power, clearly, you are testament to the power of what words can do, right? And I think the power of education is precisely why governments and states deny education. So it was a very, along with many other things, the Myanmar state denied systematically education to the Rohingya, right? In order to, as you said, almost to not just deprive them of opportunities, but I think it's something much deeper, and it reminded me of two different situations. One was, and it's not quite the same, but it was a situation in the US South under slavery where it was actually illegal to even teach enslaved people to read and write. That is a law that comes out of fear. Fear that people will voice. People already know they're being exploited. People already know what is happening to them. But it is that fear of being able to articulate, being able to challenge hegemonic systems that makes this fear of education, that makes this deprivation of education. And I think the Rohingya, my point is that the Rohingya aren't the only people or community for whom this has happened. It's happened in the extreme, right? And it's happened in a way where you have been excluded from the national community. The point was you weren't allowed to learn certain kinds of things. When you go to Bangladesh, it's a different kind of fear that education has for the Bangladeshi government. It's the fear that you will, if you get Bangladeshi education, it's the fear that you will begin to pass as Bangladeshi, even though ironically I have not met a single, and I've met a lot of people who are stateless in Bangladesh. They're not really refugees, they are stateless. The Bangladesh government does not want to give anybody refugee status because of course that comes with a lot of legal obligations. But it is true that there is this fear that suddenly, well, we've been so generous, we've let these people in, but we don't want to do more. God forbid we're going to give them education. So there's that real fear. So there are different reasons, but I think what you are doing, it's interesting that you could have chosen, I suppose, to be eventually to be a doctor or an engineer or whatever little kids want to be, especially, to try and help their communities. I think it is very telling that you've chosen journalism and to be a writer, because one of the basic things that has been taken away from the Rohingya community is their subjectivities, is the idea that they have a voice and a sense of identity. And language has been very important in that. And what you do through telling your story, which of course is very important, but also through storytelling itself is a way in which to really challenge dominant discourses around who really belongs in Myanmar and who doesn't. And I think it is very, very important that what you do is you are trying, as you said right now, you were kind of reconstruct your sense of self when it had been taken away from you. Your story is the title of your book, which I have not read. But the fact that writing saved you is writing made you also. It allowed you to think of yourself as a person rather than a number, a statistic, or just a nameless, faceless person that the Rohingya state, as somebody who had escaped genocide. That's what writing does. And I did not have time to read most of your stuff. I read, and I didn't read the thing that you referred to. I read two things by you on the way here. One was a story of this person, Nur Amin Rahman. And I thought that was a very important story that you told for us to know as a reminder for those people who don't work with refugees, this idea of making this dangerous trip and finally arriving in Canada or the US or whatever. It seems it can become kind of almost a romantic story. You've arrived, you're safe. But that is just the beginning, as you say, as you were saying also there. The harshness of refugee life and the almost impossibility of having to do things in 3 months is something that you bring out really beautifully in that story. And the trauma, the isolation, all of those things that you pointed to is something that is really important for people in this country or countries that have refugees to really understand if they are going to turn stateless people into citizens eventually, or even proper refugees, because that's what I see happening. And in terms of faith, I have a lot to say about Islam and Islamophobia and being Rohingya in Burma, but I will, I think I'll let that come out during the Q&A or whatever conversation that we have. So thank you.
Imran, you want to respond to?
I mean, I do want to respond about the persecution part. So what's happening like in Myanmar, you know, when we suffer persecution and we are not in Myanmar, you know, we are in Bangladesh, in Malaysia, Indonesia, like Thailand, in Saudi Arabia, now here. It is still affect us.
Yeah.
And how? Because, you know, they didn't let us get an education. So, you know, the 95% of the Rohingya who are living in the United States, they are illiterate. So if they are illiterate, they don't have the language, a lot of them can't work. And there are a lot of elderly who are coming to the United States, and they will never be able to become a citizen because they don't have the language, they don't have the word, and they have to pass the citizenship to become a citizen. Even though you brought them here, they are safe, they want to be a citizen, they want to have the, like, you know, privilege. Holding a passport is a really privilege. You know, so I never had that in my life. I want to hold it. Like you know, I want to look at it every single day. Finally, I have it. Because of that book, you know, people humiliated me in different countries. But there are a lot of people, they cannot become a citizen if you can't pass the test. Like, you never touch a pen. You don't know how to hold a pen. You don't know how to write a word in your life. You never wrote a word in your life. And how do you want them to become self-sufficient within 3 months and get their citizenship, and they will never be able to get the benefits that, you know, normal people get in the United States, even though if they work and then contribute. What I'm trying to say is that, you know, the persecution is still affecting all of us, even though we are not in Myanmar. We are not in Myanmar, but, you know, we are still affected. They were so clever, and the way they established the persecution was so, like, I think it was, you know, whoever planned it, they planned it very well. You know, we suffered in Myanmar, we are still suffering in every part of the world because of that education. That's why, you know, I keep talking about education because it's very important. Once I have the education, I know my right. I will speak up. If I don't have that education, I will never speak up because I don't know my rights.
Yeah, can I just respond very quickly to that? I think one of the things you were saying is that there's a real catch-22 kind of situation. It's a very difficult situation for refugees. I don't know if you would know this book, Catch-22. You would not know because you have also been deprived of various kinds of education. And one of the things I will say education does is, being deprived of education does is creates these barriers. You know, what some people might take for granted that you should know, you will not know because you have been deprived. So it creates hierarchies, and I'm already doing that, I see. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. But the main thing is that what you're saying is, being a stateless person or a refugee in this country is actually really, really hard because you can't work, or initially you don't get paper. You have 3 months in which to find work. That's what it is, right, in your case. 3 months in which to find work. But in those 3 months, you've just arrived from God knows how many months in whatever detention center. And you have enormous trauma, you're isolated, you have no social support, you don't know the language. And it's so hard to find a job, but after 3 months, if you find, you know, there is no way to find a job. So in a sense, you become re-victimized in this country. Does that, you know, is that part of what you were trying to say? It's hard, you know, it's really hard. Just arriving here and being safe is not enough.
That's what the policymakers don't understand. Like,
Yeah.
you know, though the people who are making the policies, they have the education, but they don't have the experience of being a refugee or asylum seekers. Or maybe what they have to do, like, you know, have refugees on the table. Listen to them. Or if they don't have the education, provide that education for them. Then there will be a real change because they know their communities. And if you bring people from the communities to work on the policies, and then these policies will be sufficient, effective, and they will make a difference to their lives.
Yeah.
Simran, education plays a lot of roles. One of them is transformational. It transforms you as an individual, and then it also transforms your society, your country. And I see that you were saying that there is a systematic oppression that takes place from your own country, Myanmar, to all the places that you have been, which was why it's very difficult to maintain the transformational role of education. Now, another theme is religion, right? The religion is also can be transformational at a personal and societal level. And we know that religion and education are very connected. Islam's very much significance on reading and learning and being able to read the Quran is very important. How do your community, maybe you yourself or your community, navigates the idea of religion in their personal lives and maybe their social life as well?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Like for, when you are talking about Rohingya people, we have to talk about our faith because it's a big part of our lives. We struggle everywhere in Myanmar, in other parts of the world. But when we do a struggle, we are not we don't have the privilege to talk about our mental health. And back home, we don't even know because when I left my country, I didn't even know what it was. So I know we are trying to work with doctors, nurses, psychologists. They have the resources and they are trying to help the communities, but they don't have the language. They can't communicate. Sometimes they don't know how to provide these services. They have the services, but they just don't know how to help the community because there aren't many people who are well educated. They don't have the language. They don't know how to provide these services. So what I'm saying, we struggle everywhere, but how do we survive? How do we survive? How do we move forward? It's one of the things that we have is our faith. When I was working on the project, almost everyone, they told me, I asked them, how do you cope? You have a lot of problems in your family and you go through a lot of trauma on a daily basis. And they tell me I have some times and I go to mosque or I have a very quiet place in my home. And that's when I pray. And that's when I sometimes, communicating with another human doesn't solve anything. So so what they do, they pray and they are in their quiet space and they talk with their God. No one is talking. They are in a safe environment. They are just talking with their God, and it's they solve some of their issues when they are talking with their God. And it's a big part of our lives because sometimes the problems that we face, they cannot be solved over time. It takes time. All of our struggles takes time. Even though I am in the United States, I feel things will move, things will go smoothly, but that's not the case. There are a lot of issues with a young generation because, as I said, they are illiterate. Also, our language is not written. I don't know, if I have mentioned before, our language is not written, so we don't have a written language that we can use to learn something different. With other refugees, they have a written language, and it's easier. They have a dictionary, okay, if I am from Iraq, I will have a dictionary, and then, Arabic word will be translated into English. But for the Rohingya community, we don't have a dictionary. our language is not written because the government didn't allow us to write our language. So our people are illiterate. Our language is not written, and so so the problems there are a lot of problems, but with our faith, I think we get that strength that we need to survive on a daily basis. So a lot of our people, they're very religious, and when they face the hardship, they just talk with their gods and they hope that things will be different someday, and it helps.
Just in relation to that, I was wondering, in Myanmar, of course, Rohingya, particularly Rohingya, but probably also other Muslims at this point, were really vilified and demonized, and there was a lot of Islamophobia there. We could call it Islamophobia, but Buddhist, nationalist, anti-Muslim hatred, right? Which was one of the driving forces of this genocide that's there. So it's interesting to hear. It makes total sense that religion would be a source of tremendous hope and resilience. That makes total sense. And I'm wondering what happens when, given the current situation in the world, what happens, especially with women. I'm very interested in women's issues, right? I imagine a lot of young, especially young Rohingya women in this country would feel the need to cover their heads as a sign of piety, but also as a sign of political identity. I don't know. I have not done any research on it, but that would make sense to me. So it probably does bring hope and a sense of anchoring, but what is it like? Do you have, can it also be problematic because congregating in mosques, wearing a veil, these are all, signs of danger in non-majority Muslim places, or even in some majority Muslim places sometimes. But is that a problem? I read as, or maybe it's not. Maybe I'm projecting.
It is. One of the so I work with the Rohingya girls. When I was working on the project, I wrote about the Rohingya girls, and because our culture is very conservative, because of the persecution in our country, the men, they are very protective. If you want to define the word protection in my country, it would be different. Here, it would be different. So we have to have two different definitions. Back home, the definition should be different because of the persecution. They want to be the man save their family, and they are very protective of their women. But here, if same thing happened in the United States, it would be like controlling.
You're right. That's a
same word, different definition in different places. What I was trying to say was I work with the Rohingya girls because I wanted to see what's happening with the Rohingya girls. They are in the United States. They have the opportunities. Are they moving forward? Are they getting the opportunities they should? They are free here. They can pursue whatever they want. But it's not easy for them because first of all, they were never introduced to being independent. It's scary for them. They don't want to leave their home. They don't want to leave their family because they never did in their lives. So it's not easy for them. So when I was working on the project, they showed, they shared their struggles in their community. But some of them are moving forward, but initially they struggle with their hijab. Some of them don't wear hijab, some of them wear hijab. The main point that I'm trying to make is that I want them to be educated. I want them to know their rights. And then, if you want to follow your religion, that's your choice. If you don't want to follow your religion, that's your choice. But know your rights. And that makes a difference because sometimes when they come here, they don't know their rights. They are also stuck within their community, in their comfort zone because a lot of people are illiterate. just having the language is a privilege for me. I can be here today. If I didn't have the language, I would not be able to communicate, right? So there are a lot of people, they don't have the language, they can't communicate, so they go to work, they come home, and they are still stuck within their community, within their comfort zone. They can never leave their comfort zone. So that's why, I was working with the Rohingya girls, and also the young man, I talked about one of the Rohingya men. He's a truck driver, and the way he's trying to have a family, but it's almost impossible for him to have a family because he can't mingle with other communities, and also there aren't many Rohingya girls in the United States, and all these issues. But what I'm saying, I want them to know that they have the rights, and then I just want them to know their rights, and then you can do whatever you want, and that's the right you have. The Constitution of the United States allows you to have these rights. I just want them to know, and then the rest is your choice.
Right. I think just in terms of masculinity, just to go back to what you were saying, it must be very hard to have, and this must be also intergenerational, given the kind of violence and sexual violence that on women's bodies that men have had to, see, right? Be witness to. Of course, it makes total sense that Rohingya men would be, what you're saying, conservative, would be protective, because we have to put it in that particular historical context, right? It's not about culture being conservative. Cultural mores are probably extremely what we would call conservative because of that particular kind of history. And what you're seeing is, and then girls who have grown up in camps or have fled violence are also going to be, of course, they are going to not feel independent. So there's a lot, because they if you're going to go out and there's danger outside, you're not going to want to go out, right? So I think there's so much intergenerational trauma, and there's so much work that needs to be done here in relation to thinking that you can have rights, right? Thinking that you can have a family and whatever.
Imran, I was thinking in my head that, so there are some Rohingyas still in Myanmar. There are a lot of them in Bangladesh, Malaysia, Thailand, Canada, USA, and several other places. And I know that your language is not written, So in this global diaspora of Rohingya, do you see that the identity is at stake? The identity of Rohingya at some point, it's in the long run, it's going to be at stake, and how are you envisioning to protect that or preserve that?
That's one of the main points that I really wanted to focus on. Thank you for that opportunity. So I was thinking about preserving our culture. It's almost impossible in other places, but it is possible in the United States. We have a lot of Rohingyans, and what I am hoping is that, I want my community to have the resources. I want them to send their kids to school, so that if we have enough, or maybe some educated Rohingyan, and then we can work together to preserve our culture in different states, because now what we are seeing, we have Rohingya kids, they're born here, they know nothing about Burma, Arkhana state, and what's happening and what happened. They have no idea. So if we don't preserve our culture in this nation, then these Rohingya children will not know nothing. And what we are seeing, there are a lot of kids, they don't even speak Rohingya now. Why? Because they go to school, and then when they come home, they're with their friends, because their parents are at work almost every single day, and when they come home and they sleep, so they don't have enough time to have some time with their kids. So the children don't speak Rohingya, and the parents don't speak English, so they can't even communicate. They can't even communicate, even in the United States. So that's what I was thinking, we have to send these kids to school, or people, the young generation, they need to go to school, they need to become educated so that we can preserve our culture for the next generation, so that they are not totally lost. Like, it's at some point, they will go back and they will try to track their history, and they will be in a lost. Because I was having a conversation with one of the parents, and he was telling me like the other day, I want my son to talk to my sisters back in Myanmar. And then he gave the phone to his son, and then he was like, he was talking in English, and then a parent's sister was talking in Rohingya. They couldn't communicate.
Right. I have to say, I'm sure, I don't know, Sudeep, that was a very good question, by the way, but that was that's part of this is also an immigrant problem. Just all of us who are here have children who are, may or may not know the language, but it also sounds like this is something that working class Bengali immigrants in New York City face all the time, because the parents are working all day. And when they come home, they have no time except maybe to cook or whatever. So that's, that's something that's there. What I really wanted to say in relation to what Sudipto's question and your answer is that preserving cultural memories is really, really important. Producing an archive, and I can see you through collecting stories. And collecting, Rohingya culture, I'm an anthropologist, so I'm going to be a little bit about this. But Rohingya culture isn't just about, songs, language, and whatever. It's culture that's evolved now. It's also the culture of Manus Island. It's also the culture of coming to this story. So Rohingya identity can actually be something that's living rather than something that's forced on little kids to remember. That's also something to think about. This is part of Rohingya history. This is part of Rohingya cultural memory. And you, through your storytelling and writing, you and others, obviously the burden is not just yours, can do that. Because it is without the language and with this scattered diaspora and with really very little chance of going back. It's a hard question.
It is, because during COVID, it's the way we helped our community, because everything is so verbal. The way we share our history is also verbal, because we don't have the language. So the way we communicate, like, we have WhatsApp groups. We send voice messages, because I can't write. So during COVID, so what happened, like, during COVID, all the information was shared in English. But, there are thousands of people, they don't speak English, they don't know how to read and write. And how do you want me to protect myself? And also you want to be protected too, but you are talking to me in a language that I don't understand. So in our community, we created WhatsApp group, and then I was in Chicago during that time. And then we have a Rohingya Cultural Center in Chicago. We kept the center open all day long. And also we communicated with the community through WhatsApp groups. And when we were receiving the information, we sent voice messages. And in our WhatsApp group, there were like hundreds of members. So we got the information, and then we translated it into our language, and we shared in the group, and people were educated. Wow. And this is why we are talking about policies, and we want to be involved in the policy making procedures. We want the policymakers to have a connection with the immigrant communities, because you are making policies that affects all of our lives. But if you don't have enough knowledge, you don't have to have enough knowledge. You just pick one immigrant or refugee or asylum from each community, and then they can do the work. And it's more efficient. Like when I just to give you an example of an organization that is run by refugees or asylum seekers, what happens? So like refugees who, when I was in Chicago, I saw like Rohingya refugees, when they didn't have the center, they said, just to make an appointment, it took me 2 days just to make an appointment, because they don't know how to text in English to make an appointment with a caseworker. So one of them was telling me like, okay, before I went to the resettlement agency physically to see my caseworker just to tell her that I need an appointment. So he has spent more than 2 hours or maybe 4 hours, went to the agency, saw his caseworker. He couldn't communicate with the caseworker, so the caseworker needed an interpreter. And then so it's just to read a letter, just one letter. And then it took him like almost 1 day to make an appointment. And then he came home, and then he went back to talk to the caseworker with an interpreter another day. So he has spent almost 2 days just to solve one problem. And having that center, when our community established the Rohingya Cultural Center, so people come here and they solve their problem in 10 minutes. Before he spent 2 days. So now they are more effective. They can work more hours. They can make more money. They can pay more tax to the government.
Yeah. Yeah.
So educating the communities will allow you to have more money to support more people. So it's important for us to educate the communities. You know, if they are educated, if you place them in good places, that's a solution. Right there, I can see it. Because now I am in Buffalo. We don't have a Rohingya Cultural Center. We don't have any established organization. I see people are isolated. And the people just don't know what's happening in their little home, in their little apartments.
Great. I think this is a nice segue for welcoming some of the guests' questions. So if you have questions, please raise your hands. I think so, yes. Here, Catherine.
Well, thank you all for the remarkable, vivid images that we have. And there's so many problems, they're overwhelming in Myanmar, in Bangladesh, and everywhere else, and then in the United States. I'd be interested in your own story. Are there a couple of times at some point where something made a big positive difference? You could also, I guess, point to some negative, something that held you down. But as we look for solutions to these situations, what kind of inspiration do you take away from an experience or person or something?
That's a very good question. So if I start talking about my own experience, I think, you know, it's, because of my experience, I am who I am today. Because of this struggle made me stronger. And also especially when I was in Australia's offshore detention center on Manus Island, I had a hope when I was there. I expected a lot of things from the Australian government. Like, you know, they welcome refugees, and I thought, you know, they would give me a life, a passport, and it didn't happen. And instead, they put me in offshore detention for almost 5 years. But in that place, you know, I saw refugees from other countries. There are refugees from 30 different countries. At the beginning, they were, you know, I did not understand them, to be honest, because, you know, I came from a very isolated country. You know, our government kept us very isolated. And, you know, I didn't understand them at the beginning because they were very vocal. They were fighting with the guards and about little things. Then later, it made sense. They were fighting for their rights. And because I was not familiar with the word rights. I am a human, I have rights, but I was never introduced with that word. But later it made sense, and I started writing. I just fell in love, and so when I was there, I was surrounded by a lot of Kurds, a lot of refugees. They were doing a lot of things, but I got lost in my little world with words. You know, it's kind of like art to me. Like when I'm writing, I felt like, you know, I was somewhere else, and I continued, like, you know, I was there for 5 years. I feel like, you know, now I'm trying to look back, and I feel like I was there for 5 days because of my writing. And it allowed me to communicate with the rest of the world as well, you know. So we understood each other with writing, with words. And I would encourage our future journalists and, you know, to do work to make a difference, because, you know, words have a lot of powers.
Yeah. They do indeed.
So it was very interesting to hear about how you were able to use WhatsApp during the COVID pandemic and sort of make use of technology to cross a barrier. Are there any other instances you found where technology has enabled you to sort of bridge distance or break barriers or otherwise kind of fight back against some of these repression and lack of education? And are there technological solutions or, you know, apps or any other way that technology has been able to help you overcome some of these barriers and lack of education?
Yeah, absolutely, because now I am trying to communicate with my friends, my relatives, and even my family. Because without technology, it wouldn't have been possible, right? And also, you know, because I really wanted to hear something from the Rohingya refugees who are in Bangladesh, right? I just had a couple of conversations in the morning. I told them about our event, and I asked them, like, okay, this is our opportunity. I know we have the same experience, but you live there. Your experience are like real. Like you are there. It's real. You can feel it. I'm not there. I'm out of it. I can talk about my experience, but, you know, it's not like real. So, you know, I had some conversation with them, and then you know, we cried, we laughed, but, you know, without that technology, wouldn't be able to do that. And also, when I was working with the journalists from the camps, I was not allowed to have a phone. I smuggled a phone, and I used it during the night when the guards were sleeping. I communicated with the journalists. I sent whatever I needed to send to them, and I buried it in the morning, so that no one could find it. So without the technology, I couldn't have done the work that I did, even when I was in the camp.
Thank you for sharing your story. I had many questions that I'm going to stuff just about the status of current activists and then also your ultimate goal. I was wondering if many of the Rohingya activists are at least connected in some way, and I was wondering if the goal is this yearning to go back, if it's for the international community to put pressure on Myanmar, if it's to return to Rakhine, if it's for other countries to provide safe harbor. So yes, kind of a twofold question there. One, are you able to be connected with other Rohingya doing the work you're doing? And are a lot of your goals aligned?
That's my focus, because I am really engaged with the Rohingya community who are living in the United States. That's my goal. But, you know, it's working and leading a persecuted, illiterate community is tough. It's not easy, because you are trying to lead a community that suffer persecution and they're illiterate. Like, where do you start? There are a lot of concepts that they don't understand. So we need to help them. We need to educate them. They need to become like educated about this concept. Then, you know, we can make a difference. So what I think I said before, like, you know, if we are trying to focus on the struggles that we are experiencing everywhere around the world. I feel like, from my small world, I can't solve one issue. So that's why, I started working when I was writing the stories for the Police Center. My hope was to work on the Rohingya diaspora, just trying to narrow down my ideas. Like, I want to make my ideas very narrow so that I can at least solve one problem. Because now, if I am talking about Myanmar, if I am talking about Bangladesh, if I am talking about Malaysia, it's literally out of my control, but I cannot escape this conversation. I will continue to have this conversation, but at the same time, I'm narrowing my ideas and just trying to focus on one thing, solve it, and then move on to the next one. So that's why I'm just working with the Rohingya diaspora in the United States, and then we are bringing refugees, Rohingya refugees, and activists from different states. We came to DC recently, a couple of months ago. We had conversation with senators and with other officials because we want them to know we are here. They literally don't know that we are here. Yeah. It's very funny because they go to Bangladesh, they spend thousands of dollars to solve I don't know what. But you don't even talk to me. I am in the United States. Our time zones are very convenient. If you just ask me to come to DC, I can come in like a couple of hours. But you don't invite me, you go to Bangladesh, I spend thousands of dollars, solve nothing, and you come back. So it's very tough conversation. So I will continue to have this conversation internationally, but I want to focus on a very specific thing so that I can at least solve one problem. So my focus on the education at the moment, especially the Rohingya children who are living in the United States, I want them to go to college. The girls and the boys go to college, but it's not easy. We need finance, we need resources, and we need to make these resources available for them because their parents didn't go to school, so their parents can't help. So we need to have advocates, and we need to make the resources and then finance available for these, at least for 10 people, for 10 students. And then if we can focus on 10 students each year, so within 5 years, we will have 50 students. They are highly educated, and they are ready to contribute to their community and to the United States. And that's my focus at the moment. I just want to focus on the United States and then go beyond.
Thank you all. This is a really important conversation. Imran, it'd be helpful to have some sense of your focus on the United States, education here, the Rohingya community. How many people are there? What is the percentage of illiteracy, if you have a sense of that, among the Rohingya community? How many are currently in high school, for example? What's the potential group that might in college or might be in college? And are there specific steps that you would like to see city officials, state officials, federal officials to take?
Thank you. I don't have the exact number, but we are working because we have now like Rohingya advocates in different states. We are connected. We are trying to get the numbers, but in some states we don't have any organizations, so it's really tough to get the actual number and to be connected. Because when you have a place for the community, they come. You don't have to invite them; they really come because if they get a letter in their home, in their mail, and they can't read it, they will definitely come to you. So it's like it's in some ways it's like you are forcing them to come to you, but you don't have to force them. So if you have a place, if they know that, oh, okay, I can go there and solve my problem in 10 minutes and then go to work. If they have a place, and then they will go, because I saw in Chicago they went there. They serve like more than 300 or maybe 500 clients each day. If you are trying to get any information from the resettlement agency, each caseworker only serves 5 clients. 5 clients. And having a place if it's run by their own community members, you are serving 300 and you are serving 5 clients. So there is a big number, very big gap, because we work and so we know the difference. But sometimes for our community, we don't have the resources, we don't have the manpower to really show the work that we do. We need that manpower to present our work, to show the world that what we are doing it's huge. But sometimes all these big organizations, they have the manpower, they have the education, they have the even though if they're working very little, the way they present it it's very big. So when I go to their events, wow, you did very little, but the way you presented, it's so articulated, it's so beautiful, and people are inspired. But for this little organization, they do a lot of work, but they just don't know how to present it, and they don't have enough fund. So to answer your question, so I don't have the exact number, but I am seeing a lot of Rohingya refugees are coming, and they're going to schools, and they're finishing their high school, and then I don't see that they are moving after that. They are not going to college, or maybe if they do, they just drop out, because when I was working on the Pulitzer Center, I went to their homes. I didn't you have to have an environment just to study in your home, right? They only have 1-bedroom apartment, and there are 6, 7 members in their families. You literally don't have the space to study at home. So after some time, you just give up.
Are there particular places, sorry, in the US where there are concentrations of Rohingya? Like certain states?
No. And also sometimes they are not familiar with the library system, right? And sometimes, you just have to educate them. Okay, if you don't have a space in your home, you can go to the library. You can utilize these spaces. But it's just that we have to educate them. We have to have some Rohingya or some advocate Rohingyans, so that we can get together. We can put these ideas together, help the community. Then we'll have a concrete numbers. Okay, each year we are getting this amount of Rohingya kids who are finishing their high school. We want them to be in college, pursue whatever they want. Sometimes it's very confusing to make that decision, because I struggled when I came to the United States. I jumped from one field to another, and then that. So it's very hard. But if we can put these ideas together, then we can definitely make a difference.
Thank you, Imran. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your visit to the Hill a few months ago, and how you were received by members of Congress, and if there's been any follow-up.
It was a very good visit for our community, but I haven't seen any progress. For the government officials, I feel like sometimes they are focusing on so many things, and they get lost. Sometimes they just have the conversation with me, and then someone else come, and then someone else throw something else onto them. So it's very difficult. But we have to help ourselves to get what we need. That's what I am seeing right now after that visit. Sometimes we follow up. We don't see any immediate change. So it's a very tedious process. We have to come here every month, knock on their door. Okay, we came here last month. What did you do? I talked about this. Did you follow up? Did you do something about it? I have to come every month, with a group of Rohingya, to knock on their door. Then they will do something. Otherwise, they will just forget. But to do that, I need the finance, I need the resources, I need to collect all these people. Let's go, knock on their door. If I don't knock on their door, they will not do anything. So what's happening? We are communicating with the government official on a daily basis. Sometimes, it takes a long time to hear back from them. But it's what I'm saying. We have to come here, and we have to knock on their door on a daily basis. Then I will see a change. Because if they don't see me, they just write me an email, and then they forget.
Thank you for sharing your story with us, Imran. I want to go back to the point you and Professor Siddiqui were making about cultural memories. And I completely agree, memories are really powerful. They shape narratives, they shape discourses. And to preserve them is a very, very important but large project. However, I will say that like memory preservation and memory making is also a very elite idea because you need resources. There are pictures, like if you see archives, there are pictures, there's nostalgia, there's literature, there's poems, there's wonderful things like that. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts about Rohingya culture preservation. Like I know you said that you want the youth to be educated, to have the vocabulary, to even, like Professor Siddiqui said, to articulate what has been happening, to question their past, and then to kind of preserve the culture in a way. But I was just wondering, like, and leveraging technology, like using WhatsApp, I would, like, that's a living archive within itself. And so I was just wondering, when you preserve cultural memories of a displaced people like the Rohingyas, how do you leverage, like it cannot be like a traditional archive where there are things written because there's no written language, people don't know English, there is a systemic lack of sort of access to certain things. So in that case, how do you leverage technology? Do you at all even like do anything written? It's an online archive for sure. How does that happen, and what is the past that you're nostalgic for? Because there's persecution within, like in Myanmar as well. So there's like 2 levels of victimizing and 2 levels of persecution. And how do we address memories and a living archive through technology or any other means?
I mean, I have ideas, but I have to put them together. The way we are, like, you know, we are having that conversation with our community. How can we preserve our culture? So, and how can we use the technology? Like right now, you know, we have elderlies, like a lot of old people in our community. We want them to share their stories in Rohingya. And so we can use the technology to record their verbal story, because they can't read and write, that's fine. But with technology, we can collect their stories, because, and then, you know, we can translate them into English, like the way I work with the Pulitzer Center. You know, I have their like verbal communication, and then I just wrote the stories in English. But it's not just about educating American or the world, it's also, I also want our community to go back and see something. Like, oh, okay, this is my story, I talked about it, I remember, you know, it's through technology. You know, sometimes, you know, they want to see things, you know, they're very visual. So, you know, it's, but with technology, we can create all these, like memories, we can preserve all these memories. Their stories are like, you know, a lot of people died. You know, they had a lot of things to say, but they, you know, we were not educated, we didn't have the resources, we just didn't know how to do it. Now we do, but you know, we don't have enough manpower, we don't have enough resources or maybe finance. You know, we are just talking about it, you know, it doesn't happen overnight, you know, it takes time, money, manpower. You need all these resources. Without these resources, you can't do it. But right now, we only have ideas. If we have these resources, we can put these ideas together to preserve our culture. It's possible here.
Hi. Thanks very much for sharing your story today. One of the things that's been really frustrating for me when I travel around Southeast Asia, talking to host communities about refugees in their midst, is the level of just misunderstanding of their situation. I mean, the number of times I've heard people say, well, they get their food handed to them every day. They have beds that they can sleep in every night that they don't have to worry about. It's extraordinarily frustrating. And you know, you also come across people who conflate refugees with migrant workers who are maybe in a legal status, and so think that refugees are all here to steal their jobs. And I find, from my place of enormous privilege, that I'm not a great I'm not as great an advocate for refugees as I would like. I'm not as credible. But you, as a storyteller, with the experiences you've had, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how, I mean, I'm sure you've heard these kinds of arguments. Do you have any thoughts on how to respond? And have you had any messages that you've made that you think could make a difference?
Yes, I definitely had this conversation with many people. Sometimes, you know, sometimes when I'm having this conversation with some people, they have preconceived ideas in their head, and you cannot change them because they already decided what they want to do and what they want to say. If you are talking to someone like that, you cannot change them because, you know, they just want to hear words from you, but they already made the decision. Yes.
Just respond to that. Is that, are you finished? Because I want to, no, don't want to stop
I
you.
can respond later. You can
Just
go.
very quickly, just in terms of, say, a place like Bangladesh, where most people are poor, where there is inequality and there is a scarcity of resources, initially there is a lot of welcoming, but quickly, you know, there's a scramble for already scarce resources. So I don't necessarily think that people, and I don't know, I'm not just saying, just theoretically, it seems to me it's not only that people have fixed ideas, but they're also speaking from their own experience of deprivation too, because governments anywhere, not just ours in Bangladesh, aren't able to provide what they should, and they see, they're only seeing a partial view of the stateless person or the refugee person, and they're making, assumptions based on that, and I think it is very important to push back. What I'm trying to say is, I don't think people's minds are fixed. I think people in those situations, sadly, should not be competing. They should realize what the connections are among their situations. So it is very important. I see this all the time, not just in Bangladesh, but it is very important to try and unpack those things rather than think that people have fixed minds or fix their minds about this.
It makes sense. So what the way I was talking, like, you know, I was just focusing on here, like, you know, so when you are talking about Bangladesh and talking about Malaysia and Indonesia, other places, it's because, like, you know, sometimes it's hard for them to see that, you know, refugees have food and bed, because, you know, you know, when you go to these countries, you know, there are a lot of poor people, because sometimes I am having conversation with my friends who are living in Bangladesh. You know, when they go to they go to market, you know, some people buy, like, you know, once a month a good fish. You know, there is another Bangladeshi person, and they didn't have good fish in 1 month, like, you know. So it's like, you know, you invade, like, you know, these ideas, like, hey, they are not from my country. You know, they get to eat, they get to sleep without paying anything, like, you know, these ideas. Because when I was in different places, you know, I experienced this. I had this conversation with them sometimes, when I was talking about their fixed mind, because sometimes they just, maybe they have lack of understanding of my situation, and I have a lack of understanding of their situation, because I suffer persecution and I'm just here to save my lives, and I'm doing whatever I can. And then also, you know, in their own world, they have the right to save their lives too. You know, that they are trying to get by on a daily basis. So, you know, we are very privileged to be here to think about all these issues, because we have the privilege and we have the resources, we have the food, bed. That's why we are talking about these issues. But in those countries, you know, they are not that privileged. You know, they work, they wake up and they just work, and they are just trying to survive on a daily basis. So, you know, they don't see that bigger picture of all these crises. Sometimes that's what I think.
And it's a structural problem, but that gets made into a problem of community. Yeah. But yeah.
Thank you. At this point, I would like to request Professor Anne Craig to come on the stage and share her closing remarks.
Thanks, Sudipta. Before I invite you all to join us for a reception in the back, I have one quick announcement and a few more words of appreciation. Imran, it has been our pleasure and privilege to have you with us today. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. I would like to encourage all of you to read his work on the Pulitzer Center's website. It is truly remarkable. Dina, Sudipta, thank you for enriching the conversation and for being here with us this evening. I would also like to thank everyone who came, including my Berkeley Center colleagues and Pulitzer Center collaborators who are here. We're so grateful. We're also grateful to Optimum, our facilities and catering crew in the back. And as Tom mentioned earlier, we do partner with the Pulitzer Center each year, selecting one international reporting fellow each summer. This is open to all Georgetown students, so undergrads, grad students, I see you out there. It's open to all of you. And the summer 2024 cycle, application cycle, will open on December 1st. So please be on the lookout for an announcement about the opening of the fellowship cycle, including an information session that we'll be holding later on this year. With that, I will say thank you again and invite you all to join us in the back to continue the conversation. Thank you so much, everyone.